They thought they could take my land without asking. Survey stakes went up. Trucks rolled in. Foundations poured. An HOA approved 96 homes on property they didn't own. Neighbors warned them. I sent notices. They laughed and said paperwork was handled. Construction finished. Keys were ready. Cameras were out. What they didn't know was this: I still held the deed, and I waited until court day to pull it out. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. They thought they could take my land without asking. It didn't start loudly. No confrontation, no warning knock on the door, just thin wooden survey stakes pushed into the dirt one morning, lined up too neatly to be accidental. At first I assumed it was a mistake. Land records get crossed all the time, a wrong parcel number, a lazy clerk, it happens. But then the flags multiplied. Bright orange ribbons fluttering in the wind, stretching across acres I had owned for years, land my family paid for outright, land I paid taxes on, land I had never sold, leased, or signed away. A week later, trucks arrived, not one or two, dozens, dump trucks, cement mixers, flatbeds stacked with lumber, men in hard hats walking around with clipboards, pointing, measuring, laughing like they already belonged there. I pulled over and asked one of them what was going on. HOA development, he said casually. 96 homes, phase 1. I laughed. I actually laughed, because surely he had the wrong location. He didn't. Within days, the land was unrecognizable. Trees cleared, dirt leveled, foundations carved into the ground like scars. They moved fast, faster than anyone who expects resistance. That was the first red flag. I contacted the county. They confirmed permits had been approved, zoning cleared, environmental review completed, all for land that wasn't theirs. When I asked how that was possible, I got shrugs and polite confusion. According to our documents, the HOA submitted ownership paperwork. Paperwork. I requested copies. What they sent was impressive, glossy, confident, and completely wrong. A deed transfer dated years after mine, referencing a boundary line that didn't exist, signed by a company that had dissolved before the ink supposedly dried. It was sloppy, but it was bold. I reached out to the HOA board directly. Certified letters, emails, phone calls. I attached my deed. The original. Recorded, stamped, undeniable. No response. Construction didn't slow. It accelerated. Framing went up. Roofs followed. Utility lines were run like they had all the time in the world. Neighbors began stopping by my house. Are you selling? Did you know they're building? Back there? You should really stop them before it's too late. I told them I had tried. The HOA finally responded. Not with an apology, but with confidence. Their attorney sent a short letter stating that the land dispute was resolved internally and that construction would continue without interruption. Internally, they believed momentum made them untouchable. They believed that once enough money was spent, the truth wouldn't matter, that courts would hesitate, that I would settle, that I would back down. They were wrong. I consulted my own attorney. He advised an immediate injunction. I told him no. That surprised him. Why would you let this continue? He asked. Because I wanted them to finish. I watched as walls were painted, driveways poured, mailboxes installed in neat rows, 96 homes, completed, marketed, sold. Families moved in. Children rode bikes on streets that hadn't existed a year earlier. The HOA held ribbon-cutting ceremonies and posted smiling photos online, proud of what they had built. All of it sat on land that was still mine. Court day came quietly. No spectacle. Just a crowded courtroom filled with HOA representatives, developers, lawyers, and a few confused homeowners who had been told this was a minor paperwork issue. The HOA's legal team went first. They presented permits, approvals, plans, charts showing millions invested. They spoke confidently, as if ownership were a detail beneath discussion. Then it was my turn. I stood, walked to the table, and placed a single folder in front of the judge. Inside was the deed. The same one I had sent them months earlier, the same one they ignored, original, recorded, clear. The judge read silently. The room changed. Questions followed, sharp ones. The HOA lawyers scrambled. They whispered. They flipped through documents that suddenly meant nothing. Because no amount of construction changes ownership. No permit overrides a deed, and no confidence erases truth. By the end of the day, the judge didn't need deliberation. The land had always been mine. Every home built on it was unauthorized. Every sale was invalid. The HOA was liable fully, completely, without exception. That was the moment they understood the mistake they made. They thought land was just dirt. They thought paperwork could be forced into reality. They thought I would panic. Instead, I waited, and waiting changed everything. The first sign appeared on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesdays were quiet. No traffic, no noise, just open land and the sound of wind moving through. Grass that had been there longer than any of us. The sign wasn't small, it wasn't subtle. It was planted right at the edge of my property, facing the road, impossible to miss, coming soon. Oak Ridge Estates, luxury living private community HOA managed. I pulled over and stared at it longer than I should have. There's a moment when confusion turns into something colder, not anger, recognition. This wasn't a mistake. This was intent. I walked the property line myself that afternoon. The old markers were still there. Rusted stakes my father had helped place years ago. The boundary hadn't moved. The land hadn't changed. But someone else's confidence had. Within days, more signs went up. Directional ones. Marketing banners with smiling stock photo families and promises of exclusive living. That's when people started asking questions. Strangers knocked on my door. Are you the developer? Is this where the new entrance is going? I heard this community is going to raise property values. I told them the truth. This land isn't for sale. Most laughed awkwardly, assuming I was joking. Some looked embarrassed, like they'd stepped into something uncomfortable. A few looked annoyed, as if my ownership was an inconvenience to their plans. Then the HOA trucks arrived, white pickups with logos on the doors, men in polos instead of hard hats, clipboards, tablets, confident smiles. They walked the land like tourists who had already booked the hotel. One of them approached me while I was standing near the old fence line. "Sir," he said, friendly but rehearsed, "this area is scheduled for development. We'll need you to clear out personal items." I asked him who told him that. "Our board," he said. "We own this parcel." I told him he was mistaken. He didn't argue. He didn't even check. He smiled and said, "You'll need to take that up with legal." That's when I realized how his was going to go. They weren't relying on truth. They were relying on process. The signs multiplied faster than the conversations. Every week brought something new: flags marking utility lines, spray paint on the ground, temporary fencing that crept farther inward like a slow invasion. I called the HOA office directly. The woman on the phone was polite, practiced, and unmoved. "Yes, we're aware of your claim," she said. "Our attorneys have reviewed it and ignored it. When I asked for documentation proving their ownership, she promised someone would get back to me. No one did. Instead, the signs changed. Coming soon became now selling. They hosted an open-air event on my land. Tents, balloons, caterers, music played while strangers walked paths that had never been roads, talking about square footage and upgrades. I stood at the edge and watched. No one asked me to leave. No one acknowledged me at all. It was the strangest part, being invisible on land I own. Neighbors gathered too, whispering, "Is this legal? How can they do this? Why isn't anyone stopping them?" Because confidence is louder than truth when no one challenges it publicly. I sent another round of letters, this time from my attorney. They were delivered, signed for, filed away. Construction equipment arrived the following week. That's when fear finally showed up. Not in me, but in others. A county inspector pulled me aside quietly. "You should stop this," he said. "Once homes go up, it gets complicated." I asked him why the permits were approved in the first place. He sighed. "Because everything on paper says they own it." Paper. The signs weren't just announcements anymore. They were declarations. This land had been claimed in the public eye, even if it hadn't been claimed, legally. And public perception has weight. I understood then what they were doing. They were creating a reality too big to undo. If enough people believed it belonged to them, if enough money was spent, if enough homes were built, then surely the courts would hesitate. Surely I would settle. Surely I would take a payout and go away quietly. They underestimated patience. By the time the first foundation was poured, the signs were everywhere. At the highway exit, on billboards, online listings showing homes that didn't exist yet, priced, staged, and sold in theory. Every sign was a challenge, and I accepted it. Because signs can be removed, banners can be taken down. But a deed doesn't care how many people are watching. It just waits, and so did I. By the time the first concrete trucks arrived, I had stopped hoping someone would step in and stop this. Hope is what you have when you think people will do the right thing once they understand the truth. I already knew the truth wasn't the problem. The problem was that they understood it perfectly and chose to ignore it. My attorney sent the first formal notice on a Friday afternoon, certified mail, return receipt, Clear language, it outlined everything. The legal description of the land, the recorded deed, the tax history going back decades, the absence of any lawful transfer. It demanded an immediate halt to construction. The letter was signed for Monday morning. On Tuesday, excavation began. That was the moment the situation crossed from aggressive to intentional. They couldn't claim confusion anymore. They couldn't claim ignorance. They had been warned in writing by someone whose job was to make sure words like ownership and liability were understood clearly. Instead of stopping, they responded with silence. No phone call, no rebuttal, no counterclaim, just more machines. I drove out to the property line and watched as a bulldozer tore through a section of land my children used to run across. The driver wasn't malicious, he was just doing a job. That's how these things always happen. Not through villains twirling mustaches, but through systems that reward momentum and punish hesitation. I contacted the HOA board members individually. Public records make that easy. I sent emails explaining the situation plainly. No legal jargon, no threats, just facts. Some never responded. A few sent short replies thanking me for my concern and assuring me the matter had been reviewed by counsel. One board member made the mistake of calling me directly. He spoke fast, like someone late for something more important. "Look," he said, "we've invested a lot already. This thing is moving forward." I told him investment didn't equal ownership. He sighed, impatient. "These developments are complicated. You'll understand once it's all sorted." Sorted, that word stayed with me. Because to them, sorted didn't mean correct, it meant finished. I warned him, calmly, that continuing would expose the HOA and developers to massive liability. He laughed, actually laughed. "Courts don't like undoing communities," he said. "Judges are practical people. That was their entire strategy. Create something too big to reverse. Too many families. Too much money. Too much noise. Make stopping it feel unreasonable." I documented everything. Photos, videos, dates, conversations. Every time a new phase began, I logged it. Because when people ignore warnings, they rarely realize they're leaving a trail. County officials began to distance themselves. Emails went unanswered. Calls were redirected. No one wanted their name attached once the word dispute started circulating quietly, but permits kept coming. It was like watching a machine run after the emergency stop had already been pulled. Momentum carrying it forward even as everyone knew it shouldn't be moving anymore. Neighbors were split. Some were furious on my behalf. They wrote letters, attended meetings, asked questions that made HOA representatives uncomfortable. Others were excited. They liked the idea of new shops, new schools, higher property values. To them, my ownership was an obstacle, not a right. One neighbor said it out loud. "Can't you just take the money?" she asked. "Why fight it?" Because if ownership only matters when it's convenient, it doesn't matter at all. The developers reached out next. Not to negotiate, but to intimidate. Their lawyers sent a thick packet filled with jargon and threats of countersuits, delays, and protracted litigation. Buried inside was a single sentence off. "Ring to discuss resolution." The number attached was insulting, not because it was small, but because it assumed I was afraid. I declined. Construction entered full swing. Framing crews worked on to dusk. Roof lines appeared like a sudden forest of angles and shingles. Street names were chosen and installed, names I had never approved on land I still owned. I attended an HOA meeting, quietly sitting in the back. They spoke openly about timelines, sales targets, and move-in dates. My land was referred to as Phase 2. Not once did they mention me. When I stood and identified myself, the room went silent. The board president cleared his throat and said, "This meeting is for residents only." I told him I was the landowner. He said that was disputed, as if a recorded deed were an opinion. Security was called, not on them, on me. I left without a scene, but the message was clear. They believed authority came from confidence, not correctness. And confidence was something they had in abundance. What they didn't have was patience. They didn't understand that every ignored warning strengthened my position. Every email unanswered, every letter dismissed, every dollar spent after notice, all of it would matter later. Warnings aren't meant to stop people who think they're untouchable. They're meant to establish that what happens next is a choice. And they chose to continue. They chose to build. They chose to sell. They chose to ignore the one thing they should have respected from the beginning: ownership. And once that choice was made, the outcome stopped being negotiable. It just hadn't arrived yet. Most people think strength looks like action, stopping things, shouting, filing emergency motions, showing up with authority and forcing the world to listen. That's what everyone expected me to do next. Even my own attorney leaned forward across his desk, hands folded, voice careful. If we file for an injunction now, he said, we can slow this. Maybe stop it entirely. I asked him one question. What happens if we don't? He hesitated. They finished building. I nodded. Good. He stared at me like I had just misunderstood the stakes. They're building homes, he said. Families will move in. This gets messy. I already knew it would, but I also knew something else. Messy for who? Because the truth was simple. They were already past the point of innocence. They had been warned. They'd been notified. They'd been given proof. Everything they did from this point forward wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, and decisions have consequences. So I let them finish. I drove past the site every few days, watching the transformation like a slow-motion crime scene. The land didn't recognize itself anymore. Where open fields once stretched uninterrupted, streets now curved confidently, lined with identical houses spaced with mathematical precision. Concrete replaced soil. Sod replaced grass that had grown naturally for decades. They moved fast, faster than any development I'd ever seen. That speed wasn't ambition, it was fear. Fear that someone would stop them. Fear that the truth would surface too loudly to ignore. So they rushed. Crews worked weekends. Lights burned late into the night. Inspection signs were flipped from red to green in record time. Corners were cut. I could see it. Cracked curbs patched hastily. Drainage hastily redirected. Utility trenches filled too quickly. When you're trying to outrun reality, you don't slow down to do things perfectly. Sales started before construction finished. Pre-sold, the signs bragged. Model homes opened with balloons tied to mailboxes that hadn't been assigned yet. Sales agents smiled and spoke about strong foundations and solid investments. I wondered if any of them knew, if none of them had asked the most basic question. Who owns the land? Families toured the homes. Children ran through hallways that smelled like fresh paint and optimism. Couples stood in kitchens, imagining futures. I felt no anger toward them. They were just like the construction workers, caught inside a system that assumed legitimacy because everyone else seemed confident. Confidence is contagious. The HOA board was everywhere now. Photo ops, social media posts, press mentions about successful community growth. They shook hands with local officials who were suddenly very careful about where they stood and what they said. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of this if it succeeded, and everyone assumed it would. That's the thing about momentum. Once it builds, people mistake it for inevitability. My attorney checked in weekly. Still want to wait? He asked every time. Yes. Because with every shingle laid, their liability grew. With every home sold, the situation became less defensible. With every family moved in, the illusion of permanence deepened. Judges don't like stopping projects, but judges hate being lied to. And what the HOA was doing now wasn't just building on disputed land. It was selling certainty they didn't possess. By the time the last home was completed, the community looked finished, peaceful, established. Streetlights glowed at dusk. Trash bins lined the curbs on collection day. HOA newsletters went out welcoming residents to their forever neighborhood. They held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I watched from across the street as a red ribbon stretched between two decorative stone columns. Columns placed squarely on my land. Applause followed as it was cut. Someone gave a speech about vision and perseverance. I wondered how many of them remembered the letters, the warnings, the emails that said clearly, "You do not own this." Or maybe they remember, read and chose to forget. That happens too. People have an incredible ability to ignore danger when ignoring it is profitable. After construction ended, something changed. The urgency disappeared. Calls stopped. Emails slowed. They thought they were safe now. Finished projects feel protected, untouchable. That's when I knew the timing was right, because letting them finish wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. There would be no argument that I overreacted, no claim that I halted progress prematurely. No suggestion that a compromise could have avoided damage. They had been allowed to do everything they wanted, and now the consequences belonged entirely to them. When my attorney finally filed the case, it wasn't complicated. There were no emergency motions, no dramatic accusations, just facts, ownership, notice, continuation after notice. Sale of property they did not own. The paperwork was thick, not because the case was complex, but because the evidence was overwhelming. Photos spanning months, signed receipts proving delivery of warnings, meeting minutes where my land was discussed as if ownership were settled. They had documented their own recklessness beautifully. I didn't attend the first hearing. I didn't need to. They were still confident then, still smiling, still assuming this would end with a settlement and a quiet check. They hadn't realized yet what letting them finish had done. They had crossed from dispute into certainty, from assumption into liability, from optimism into exposure. Every house stood as proof, every family as a witness, every dollar as a receipt. Letting them finish wasn't weakness. It was patience weaponized, and by the time they understood that, it was already too late. Court day didn't feel dramatic at first. There were no cameras waiting outside, no shouting, no last-minute deals struck on courthouse steps, just a gray building, a metal detector, and people walking in with folders thick enough to suggest confidence. The HOA arrived early. They always did things early, as if preparation alone could substitute for correctness. Board members sat together in tailored suits, whispering and nodding like executives about to close a deal. Developers occupied the front rows, relaxed, almost bored. Their lawyers spread documents across the table like they were setting up a presentation they had already rehearsed 100 times. They expected this to be procedural, a formality, something that ended with a number and a non-disclosure agreement. I arrived quietly and took a seat behind my attorney. No one looked at me. That told me everything. When the judge entered, the room stood, then settled. The HOA's lead attorney stood first. He was polished, the kind of man who spoke in measured tones and never wasted a word. He began by framing the case exactly how they wanted it seen: a misunderstanding, a paperwork discrepancy, a dispute complicated by development timelines and public interest. He spoke about investments, about families, about disruption. He never said the word ownership. Instead, he said expectations. They presented their evidence confidently: permits, approvals, zoning clearances, contracts with builders and utilities. A thick stack of paper slid across the table toward the judge. Millions of dollars reduced to ink and signatures. Then he made the mistake they had been building toward all along. He argued permanence. These homes are complete, he said. People live there. Children attend nearby schools. Undoing this would cause irreparable harm. He paused, letting that sink in. The judge nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then the attorney concluded with the assumption that had carried them this far. At most, he said, this is a matter of compensation. At most. When he sat down, there was a quiet confidence in the room, like the ending was already written. My attorney stood. He didn't rush, didn't posture. He began with something simple. Your Honor, he said, before we discuss harm, expectations, or compensation, we need to establish one fact. He turned and looked directly at the HOA's table. Who owns the land? There was a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The HOA attorney objected, calling it undisputed. My attorney nodded. Exactly, he said. It is undisputed, just not in the way they suggest. He approached the bench and handed the judge a single document. Not a stack, not a binder, one piece of paper. The deed, original, recorded, stamped. The judge took it and began to read. The room went still. This wasn't the kind of silence that comes from boredom. It was the kind that comes when a room realizes it may have been wrong for a very long time. My attorney spoke again. This deed predates every permit, every approval, every contract presented today. He paused. My client never sold the land, never leased it, never transferred it. The HOA attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, ownership is contested. No, the judge said calmly, still reading. It isn't. That was the first crack. The judge asked questions, not the kind lawyers like, direct ones. On what basis did you claim ownership? Who verified this deed transfer? Why did construction continue after notice? The HOA's legal team scrambled. They flipped through pages, whispered urgently, cited internal reviews and assumptions that suddenly sounded flimsy out loud. My attorney submitted the warnings, certified letters, emails, receipts proving delivery, dates highlighted clearly. Construction timelines followed. Each warning matched with continued development. The judge leaned back. So you were informed, he said, and Conti. Nude anyway. The HOA attorney tried to redirect. We believed. The judge raised a hand. Belief is not ownership. That sentence changed everything. Developers shifted in their seats. One board member stared at the table, jaw tight. Another whispered something that went unanswered. The judge asked about sales. Homes sold after notice. Contracts signed knowing ownership was disputed. The HOA attorney attempted to argue good faith. My attorney responded calmly. Good faith ends when you're told to stop and choose not to. There was no theatrics. No yelling, just the slow dismantling of an assumption that had never been challenged in a room like this before. By the time closing statements arrived, the outcome was no longer uncertain, only its scope. The judge took a recess. People stood, stretched, whispered. That's when panic finally surfaced. The HOA board members stopped smiling. The developers made phone calls that went unanswered. One homeowner quietly asked a lawyer what this meant for them. No one answered honestly. When the judge returned, the room stood again, then sat. The ruling was delivered plainly, ownership affirmed, unauthorized construction confirmed, liability assigned. The HOA was responsible. The developers were responsible. Jointly and severally, sales invalid, permits void as applied to the land, damages to be assessed. There was no pause for reaction, just consequences laid out cleanly. The judge ended with something that felt almost instructional. This court does not reward momentum, he said. It recognizes rights. The gavel came down. That sound didn't echo loudly. It didn't need to, because the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. People filed out slowly. Some avoided eye contact. Some looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time. Outside, the confidence was gone, replaced by calculation, by fear. They finally understood what court day really was, not the end. The moment reality arrived. After the ruling, nothing ended quickly. That's something movies get wrong. They make it seem like justice lands all at once, clean and final, like a door slamming shut. In real life, justice lingers. It settles into places people hoped it wouldn't reach. The courtroom emptied slowly, not because anyone was confused, but because everyone understood exactly what had just happened and didn't know where to go next. The HOA board left together, no longer talking. Their unity had been confidence. Without it, there was nothing to say. Developers avoided the press waiting outside. They'd walked in certain this would cost them money. They walked out realizing it would cost them everything else too. I stayed behind for a moment, seated, listening to the room breathe again. My attorney leaned over and spoke quietly. "It's over," he said. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "Now it starts." The news spread faster than construction ever had. Homeowners found out in fragments, rumors at first, then confirmations. HOA emails went out using words like temporary, procedural, under review. None of those words changed the truth. The land didn't belong to them. It never had. That reality began working its way through the community like a slow earthquake. Banks froze transactions. Title insurers stopped returning calls. Realtors quietly pulled listings that had already closed. Families asked questions the HOA couldn't answer. What happens to our house? Do we still own it? Can we be forced to leave? The HOA issued statements blaming developers. Developers blamed contractors. Contractors blamed permits. Permits blamed nothing, because permits don't own land. Ownership does. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. Lawyers billed by the hour. Accountants recalculated numbers that no longer made sense. The HOA's reserves vanished in weeks. Special assessments followed, enormous ones. Residents who had trusted the board now stared at five-figure bills just to keep the lights on and the lawyers paid. Some refused, some couldn't afford it. Foreclosures began quietly, not because people hadn't paid their mortgages, but because the homes themselves were suddenly legally unstable. A house without clear title isn't shelter. It's risk. The irony settled in slowly. The HOA had justified everything in the name of protecting property values. Now those values were gone. The board resigned one by one. No speeches, no apologies, just short emails announcing departures effective immediately. Developers declared bankruptcy in carefully worded filings that named dozens of creditors but never mentioned the word mistake. Lawsuits multiplied. Homeowners sued the HOA. The HOA sued the developers. Developers sued title companies. Title companies sued everyone back. It was chaos, predictable, documented, entirely avoidable chaos. And through it all, one fact remained untouched. The land was mine. People asked what I planned to do with it. Some assumed I would evict everyone immediately. Others expected a massive settlement. A few called me cruel for not fixing it quietly. They misunderstood something fundamental. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is emotional. What happened next was practical. I worked with the court to establish a framework. Residents weren't trespassers. They were victims. They had been sold certainty by people who didn't own the right to sell it. That mattered. Temporary occupancy agreements were issued. Rent was set far below market. Enough to maintain the land, nothing more. Families stayed, children finished school years. Lives weren't ripped apart overnight, but ownership was never transferred. Because consequences still mattered, the HOA no longer existed to enforce rules. No fines, no letters, no authority. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same organization that once believed rules were more important than reality no longer had the power to enforce anything at all. Developers tried to negotiate. Late, desperate attempts to buy what they should have secured before building. Their offers were different now, careful, humble, realistic, but timing matters, and timing had passed. Eventually, parcels were sold properly, slowly, legally. Some homes were removed, some redesigned, some replaced with open land again. The community shrank, but stabilized. It became quieter, less confident, more honest. Years later, people would still ask how it happened. How could they build so much on land they didn't own? The answer was always the same. They didn't think ownership mattered as much as momentum. They believed confidence could overwrite reality. They believed no one would wait them out. They were wrong, because the truth doesn't rush. It doesn't shout. It doesn't compete. It waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't need drama. Just documentation. The land is still mine, not because I fought harder than anyone else, but because I never surrendered what was already mine in the first place. That's the part people miss. Justice didn't take the land back. It simply recognized that it had never left. And that recognition changed everything.